Good morning, folks. Afternoon, depending on when you're going to be watching this. This is Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich with the Sheriff's Report. It's good to be back with the show. I just realized that, amazingly enough, this is our 12th year on the air. It's been an amazing time. I hope that you found some of the shows interesting. And I hope that you find this one interesting. I know you'll find it controversial. It seems that's what we live in anymore. We live in a very controversial world. And people were so glad to see 2020 end. The problem is I don't see 2021 being much different than 2020. I still see a vastly divided nation. I still see politicians working to divide this nation rather than united, even though they say that that's their end goals. You can't unite when you use divisive words. Words matter. Words count. And it's time for our leaders to understand that. As you can see, the title of this show is The Courageous Conversation No One Wants to Have. And I don't know how many times I've had activists say this to me: Sheriff, we need to have a courageous conversation before we can unite to fix problems. The problem is, for the last 5 years after hearing that, I have not once seen any of those activists that have said those words want to have that courageous conversation. And why is that? Well, we'll find out as we proceed through the show today what might be the motivation for not wanting to have this conversation. So we all know that last week, one of the most reprehensible acts I've seen in our nation's history during my lifetime, at least, happened at our Capitol building in Washington, D.C. A group of thugs stormed that building. They desecrated the halls of our Capitol of Congress. And I don't make any kind of apology for that, for them, or try to even make it right for them. I hear right now from people on the extreme right, well, it was Antifa. Antifa did it all. Now, is it possible that Antifa was there? It wouldn't surprise me. That is their MO. They're anarchists, and anarchists join protests and they turn them into riots. That is their MO. But I'm sorry, I'm not letting off that easy, folks on the right, extreme right, because most of the people that are being arrested are from the right. They're not Antifa. I haven't seen or heard of an Antifa member being arrested quite yet on that one. And I wish you folks on the right would stop acting like the folks on the left, because this summer, as our cities burned, the left blamed militias for causing all the problem. As a matter of fact, the night of the riot here in Spokane, the propaganda machine from the left started up and they blamed the Proud Boys for the looting and for the destruction. Folks, I've seen the video. I've seen the photographs. And we know definitively that the Proud Boys were not there. They weren't. Now, did some 3%ers come downtown about 10:30 at night? Yes, they did. And they were asked to leave, and they did leave. But the second weekend, I can tell you that the Proud Boys were in Spokane. They came in force, about 32 of them. Why? Because the left accused them of causing the damage the weekend before. Both the left and the right all you do is point fingers at each other, and you try to make each other look bad, and you want to blame each other for all the world's problems. But you people on the extreme are the problems. You politicians that buy into the people on the extremes are the problems. You've heard it about me talking about this for many years. I was contacted by a local reporter, Daniel Walters, over the weekend. He said, you know, we're kind of pretty much living some of the stuff you talked about in 2015. And I went, well, you could say that, but we cannot continue to point fingers at each other. And as you can see, our president-elect, Joe Biden, he came right out of the chute. And for those of you who aren't viewing this on the podcast or listening to it on the radio, I'll just read what the president-elect had to say. No one can tell me that if it had been a group of Black Lives Matter protests yesterday, that they wouldn't have been treated very differently than the mob that stormed the Capitol. We all know that's true, and it's unacceptable. Okay, once again, it's amazing to hear that type of rhetoric, because here's my response to the president-elect. And it is, President-elect Biden, you say that there's no one that can tell you that it had been different. Well, there is at least one law enforcement leader in America willing to tell you the following. Sir, you are wrong, and you need to stop using race to divide our nation. Pure and simple. It is time for these politicians and activists to stop using race to divide this nation. We're so much better than this on both sides of the line. People, you have forgotten that you are not Democrats. You are not Republicans. You're not libertarians. You're not socialist. You're not Marxist, or any of the other adjectives, descriptors, whatever you want to call them. You are Americans. Americans first. And it's time that you get that through your heads. I am so tired of the party system, because the party system is designed for power. Power from one side or the other. And George Washington warned us about this. He warned us about the party system. He said, you know, with the party system, one side gets in power, and then they fall out of power to the other side. The other side uses that new power as retribution for whatever the other side did, and it's a never-ending spiral. It will destroy and divide this nation, and it has. I'm not a Republican. I'm an American. So, going back to what the Vice President said, it wouldn't have mattered who was there. It would have been handled the same way. Now, what happened at the Capitol? Why did it go so badly? Well, sadly, 20 years after 9/11, we still have intelligence gaps. We still have leaders that don't want to listen to intelligence coming from other networks or sources within our law enforcement sectors. We are still siloed. Sorry to break that news to you, but that's what's happened to us, and that's what happened there. People didn't believe that somebody would do such a thing. Well, you have to remember that on all sides, Black Lives Matter protests or Trump supporter protests, you have a spectrum on both sides. Those who just want to protest and have their voice heard, those who support their positions in that, on both sides, and then you have extremes that are wanting to make this a very, very divisive state. They are willing to do wrong. They're willing to cause problems. They are willing to cause insurrection. They're willing to overthrow this country. And you need to understand that. That's what the extremes are all about. They're not about saving this nation. They're about tearing this nation down. Both sides. I've heard the same rhetoric at the local level. This summer, I heard Representative Marcus Riccelli, Sheriff, if it had been black people carrying guns downtown, you would have arrested them. I don't know what world, Marcus, I don't know in what world that would happen. Everybody has the same rights. Everybody has the same constitutional rights. It wouldn't have happened the way you say, but you are willing to use race to continue the divide. We need to stop the divide. So it happens at all levels. It's not just the president-elect. It's not just the president. It's at our local level, and it goes all the way down to our city councils. So let's take a look at the BLM Antifa protests of the summer. You had Seattle. You had an autonomous zone set up, Chaz, then they changed it to CHOP because they understood that, an autonomous zone meant that you had created a foreign nation on US soil. And that's what they did. And they melted down into it was amazing to watch. The first thing they did was build a wall around them. Then they put armed guards up. And then they had self-appointed warlords take over, and it became a totalitarian state, if you will. And this is what happens. This is tyranny. Whenever people talk about revolution, they talk about all this. Revolutions don't always go all that well. I only know one in the history of the world that actually went all that well and set up what we live today as the experiment of self-government. And it's still an experiment. We're seeing if it's actually going to survive. Then you had Portland, 100 days of attacks on a federal building and rioting in the streets. People died there. You had riots in Denver. You had riots in almost every major city there was. And on election night in Manhattan, in New York City, you had businesses boarded up because they feared protests, especially if President Trump would have won that election. That's third world, folks. That's not the United States, but that's what we devolved to in 2020. And, people always challenge me, Antifa is just an idea. No, it's an organization that has ideology. And, they weren't really involved. Well, yeah, they were. And this is Denver, folks. This is a flyer from Denver. I actually watched the videos of this one. And, the rhetoric is all divisive, and it's using race to divide. They say they're against racism, they're against fascism, and they're against the police. But they use race to divide us. It says Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Murder, abolish the police, abolish capitalism. And in the bottom corner, what do you see? The hammer and sickle. Why? Because both organizations are steeped in Marxist philosophy. You do some research, don't take my word for it, you can find it. They are steeped in Marxist philosophies. This is what I get to track. And I want you to notice the date. Yeah, that was this December 26th that this was supposed to happen. Thank goodness the individual was trying to get this put together, went sideways with her support base. But if you notice, calling all freedom fighters, This flyer says, calling all freedom fighters, join organizers in protesting against police brutality in Spokane. Our goal is to redistribute funds from the department and prioritize community bonds, education, and helping the homeless community. But they were going to do that by occupying SPD's precinct downtown. It says occupy Spokane PD precinct. And some of the other things that they support are abolition, abolish, defund the police, end poverty, free housing, free Palestine. And this is where they really went sideways. They actually divided their base because free Palestine means the end of Israel. End SARS, end gun violence, reparations, give land back, and again, join us to occupy SPD precinct. This is local, folks. This is what we continually look at, and we are continually tracking. Intelligence matters. So what would have been the differences in the responses? Well, the attack on the Capitol, force was used. We've all seen the videos of police fighting the mob, and a police officer died fighting with that mob. Tear gas was used. Lethal force was used. Arrests, they were fairly swift. There were nationwide wanted posters put out. I've seen them. Actually, amazingly, I got some through private accounts. There were calls for charges ranging from sedition to insurrection. The one thing I haven't seen is, I haven't seen anyone setting up GoFundMe accounts to bail these people out. So the difference in the response? Well, let's see. What happened this summer when we had riots? They were called mostly peaceful protests by the media and by politicians, by activists. There were few arrests. If they were arrested, they were automatically provided bail funds. We actually had the vice president-elect set up a bail fund for these rioters. There were few charges. Matter of fact, many prosecutors said they weren't going to charge these people. I hadn't seen a nationwide wanted poster on anybody that tried to lock the Seattle police officers in their building and burn them alive, or down in Portland when they tried to do the same thing at the federal building, or for attacking the federal building, or for injuring any police officers or National Guard members. I haven't seen any nationwide protest or wanted posters on that. They were mostly peaceful, they said. Okay. So let's go back one slide and go take a look. The difference on the Capitol, yeah, force was used. Yeah, we used force in the riots. Tear gas was used. Yeah, lethal force used in the riots. I believe 2 protesters after a summer of protesting were killed during those protests. 2. There were multiple police officers and citizens that were killed during those riots and protests. The rest were fairly swift for the Capitol, and we have nationwide wanted posters, calls for charges of sedition and insurrection. Well, folks, what happened in our cities was also insurrection. We don't want to say that, quite frankly, you're racist if you say that. So most of this summer dealt with police use of force. So going with what our vice president always likes to say, or our president-elect, I should say, always likes to say, what does the science say about this? Let's follow the science on this. My question is why hasn't anybody asked what the science actually says on use of force, police use of force? What does the science actually say? Well, this is a book that I read. Actually, it was a textbook in my master's classes. Professor Darrell Ross wrote the book. So here's the information concerning it. You can find it on Kindle. It's Civil Liability in Criminal Justice, 7th edition. And Dr. Ross spent a lifetime studying use of force. And here are some of the findings that he has put out. There is no question that acts of police misconduct have occasionally occurred and that excessive force has been used in some circumstances. You can't get away from that. That is true. There are some times that happens. There is no empirical evidence, however, to support claims that excessive force or officer misconduct occurs with statistically significant frequency. It's a rarity, folks. It happens very rare. That's what the science says. Let me reread one part of that. Officer misconduct, excessive force, occurs with statistically significant frequency. All right? There's no evidence of that. There is no empirical evidence that it occurs with any statistically significant frequency. No evidence. Why hasn't media brought this forward? Why haven't they done this research? Why haven't our politicians actually looked into this? And I won't ask why the activists haven't, because that's not their agenda. And neither is it for the media and or the politicians. It is just not their agenda. They're not interested in the science. Now, if this was COVID, if this was climate change, we'd all be following the science. But when it comes to an important issue, quite frankly, an issue that has been used to divide this nation since 2014, we don't want to follow the science. Civil liability in criminal justice, again, Dr. Ross's work. He goes on to state this. These studies indicate that force used by the officer is infrequent in citizen and police encounters and is generally a result of I can't say it today. It's a result of bad citizen. Every once in a while, speech impediments come out. I'm not immune to that either. These studies, it goes on to say, indicate that police use of force is a complex issue. It is rare in occurrence, given the number of citizens and police contacts and the number of arrests that are made annually. It's a rare occurrence. That's what the science says. Dr. Ross goes on, in his text, it states, Ross in 2005 performed a content analysis of 43 published police use of force studies in the United States from 1969 to 2003 in order to assess the trends and patterns of the study's findings. Highlights of the study show that the police use force, let me reread that for you. Highlights of the study showed that the police used any force in about 3% of the arrests, and excessive force was used less than 1% of the arrest. So out of all the arrest, excessive use is less than 1%. Less than 1%. I wish we could say it didn't happen, ever. But again, it does. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that we're 100% always right. But it happens less than 1% of the time. Contrary to what you have been told by the media and what you have been told by politicians and activists, that it happens all the time. No, it is that rare. Out of all the arrests, which is a small portions of the contacts we have with our public, out of all the arrests, less than 1%. Dr. Ross continues, the combined findings of these studies revealed that police use of force is rare, given the millions of annual citizen contacts, and that the use of excessive force was estimated to be less than 1% of the instances where force was used or threatened. Again, spelling out, it is a rarity. Another study that Ross uses in his text was a study by Hickman and several professors that were involved in the study with him in 2008. They performed a comparative analysis of the findings of 36 published studies regarding the nature of police use of force, of less lethal force, covering a period from 1980 to 2008. And when we get ready to come back from our break, because this is going to be probably a 2 to 3 part series, I'll give you the results of that study. This is Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich with the Sheriff's Report. Have a great day. We'll continue this next week.